Now it's really an incredible pleasure to introduce another one of my heroes, actually. Dave Sumner, K1ZZ, Chief Executive Officer of the American Radio Relay League. Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And thank all of you for being here tonight. I'm not sure which is more intimidating, trying to follow Lee's video presentation or being the only thing between you and the prize drawing. In either case, it's good to be with you here this evening. It's good to have an ARRL National Convention here on the West Coast for the first time since 1992. And congratulations to the Mount Diablo Club and to everyone involved in Pacificon who pitched in to make this convention such a success. Those of us who came from afar could not have asked for a warmer welcome. Although the weather yesterday didn't quite measure up to the sunny California image. However, I see that overnight somebody pushed the reset button. Whether it's sunny or not, it's good to be back in California. Growing up in Connecticut, for me, California was DX. My first trip out here was 45 years ago to visit my sister, who was teaching school in Merced. And in the course of more than 40 years on the ARRL staff, I've enjoyed countless meetings and conventions here on the West Coast. Recently, my wife Linda, K1ZZ, worked in Sacramento for a couple of years, and of course I'd fly out to see her at every opportunity. And back in 2000, our daughter Darren, N1UCI, chose to study music industry at the University of Southern California, which of course involved a few trips to that end of the state. Darren is passionate about music, and from somewhere, she got the idea that it was a good idea to try to turn her passion into a career. However, she soon learned two things. First of all, she realized that digital technology was going to fundamentally change the music business. And second, she discovered that some of the people in the music business aren't very nice. So, to avoid spending her career with not so nice people, after graduation she came back east and became a lawyer. In Washington. So as Darren discovered, turning one's passion into a career isn't always easy. In his memoir, The Dangerous Animals Club, actor Stephen Tobolowsky tells the story of his friend Jack, whose passion was the theater. Jack was in a small theater company, and they were preparing to put on a play when he announced that he had to leave the group because he had been hired for the Broadway production of Pippin. The rest of the troupe was astonished at this news, but of course they wished him well, and Jack told them to look him up if they ever came to New York, which of course they did. Wanting to celebrate their friend's good fortune, a few weeks later, they all made the trip to New York City and got tickets to the play. And once in the theater, of course, they looked in the program for his name, and there was no Jack. They checked every actor who came on the stage, no Jack. So not knowing what else to do, after they enjoyed the show, they went outside to the stage door and asked the security guard if he knew their friend. He said, "Oh, Jack, sure, he's here. Let me go get him." So a few minutes later, out comes their friend Jack, and he's wearing rubber gloves that are extending all the way up both arms, all the way past his elbows. And after a bit of hemming and hawing, he admits that he isn't actually in the play. Some of the scenes involved bringing live animals on stage. And his job is to avoid unpleasant surprises by giving them enemas before they go on stage. But hey, he said, I'm on Broadway. My own passion, one that I share with so many of you in this room, only rarely requires rubber gloves. It's a passion for the art and science of radio communication. And have you ever thought about how remarkable it is that there is such a thing as amateur radio? Just the fact that there's such a thing as radio itself is remarkable. It was in 1886 that Heinrich Hertz proved the existence of electromagnetic waves. But Hertz viewed his discovery as a laboratory curiosity with no practical application. He died just a few years later at age 36, not even imagining that he had laid the foundation for the age of wireless communication. It would fall to Marconi and others, including countless amateurs, to harness electromagnetic waves and use them to transport information across vast distances with no physical connection. You can imagine what sort of black magic that seemed at the time. I believe radio is unique in having been cutting-edge technology at the dawn of 2 different centuries. Marconi claimed to have spanned the Atlantic in 1901, just 15 years after Hertz's experiments. And while there's room for skepticism about that particular claim, Marconi's subsequent commercial success is undeniable. At the time, what we would now call the killer app for wireless was communicating with ships at sea. Until then, once a ship left port and disappeared over the horizon, it was entirely cut off from the rest of the world. Because of the Titanic disaster, which of course we just marked the 100th anniversary of earlier this year, the advent of radio is most often linked to maritime safety, but its commercial and military impact was equally dramatic. Now we're in the early years of the 21st century, and wireless broadband is changing how we gather information and interact with one another. Here in Silicon Valley, I don't need to elaborate on that because many of you here in the room are making that happen. This year also marks the 100th anniversary of radio station licensing. But we shouldn't make the mistake of assuming that it was the beginning of amateur radio. In fact, to use a phrase that we have heard over and over again in subsequent years, for many it was the end of amateur radio as we know it. In the years between 1901 and 1912, thousands of radio amateurs had constructed their own stations. There was no regulation, either by the government or by the amateurs themselves. Some amateurs reportedly took pride in their ability to block naval communications, in part because their equipment was better than the Navy's. Today, we can only imagine how chaotic the airwaves must have been at the time and how frustrating to operate under such circumstances. Well, maybe we can imagine if you've listened to a pileup recently. Licensing was the first step toward a more orderly and efficient use of the radio spectrum, which ultimately benefited everyone, including radio amateurs, although at the time many thought otherwise. The story of the ARRL, whose national convention, of course, we're enjoying this weekend, begins little more than a year later. The Radio Club of Hartford was organized early in 1914. It soon dawned on one of its founders, a businessman and inventor, whose name you well know, Hiram Percy Maxim. It dawned on Hiram Percy Maxim that one way to extend the limited range of amateur stations was to organize a network of relay stations whose operators would agree to forward messages for one another. So the American Radio Relay League was born. This was not the first attempt to form a national association for amateur radio, but it soon proved to be the most successful, and as we now know, the most enduring. The entry of the United States into World War I put an end to amateur radio. Amateurs flocked to the recruiting stations, anxious to put their skills to the service of their country. The ARRL actually ceased operation for the duration of the war. Fortunately, it was only temporary, because soon after the armistice, the Secretary of the Navy launched a serious effort in Congress to extend the wartime control over radio that the Navy had enjoyed and to make that permanent. Amateur radio could have ended then and there for all time. But Mr. Maxim and the ARRL led the fight to restore amateurs' transmitting privileges. Hiram Percy Maxim was a true visionary. To me, the clearest evidence of his genius is that within weeks of the first two-way transatlantic amateur contact in November 1923, he had recognized the need for an organization to represent amateur radio internationally. He also realized that while the ARRL was by far the strongest amateur organization at the time, it was important that the International Amateur Radio Union have as much international flavor as possible. So the organizational meetings were held in Paris in 1924 and 25. From that beginning, the IARU grew into a global federation of national amateur radio societies and has become a respected member of the international telecommunications community. Over the ensuing decades, the IARU has achieved an amazing record of success at conferences of the International Telecommunication Union. The ARRL serves as the international secretariat of the IARU, and over the past 40 years, I have had the privilege of working alongside scores of radio amateurs, nearly all of them volunteers, from all over the world, as we channeled our shared passion to protect amateur radio through the IARU and its member societies. Currently, the secretary of the IARU is Rod Stafford, W6ROD, who lives right here in San Jose. Rod's at the convention, although he couldn't join us this evening. So tonight, amateur radio has existed for more than a century. The ARRL is approaching the celebration of its own centennial in 2014, little more than a year from now. The next ARRL National Convention, which I hope you'll all come to, will be held in Hartford, where it all began. Mark your calendars for July 17 to 20, 2014. We're planning quite a celebration. After all, there aren't many institutions that reach the century mark while retaining their health and vitality. And make no mistake, amateur radio and the ARRL are in very good shape. Amateur radio in the United States is growing. There are now more than 700,000 FCC amateur licensees. The ARRL is enjoying its 6th straight year of membership growth, right through the recession, with 159,000 members. But numbers are not the whole story. The scope of amateur radio is expanding. A few weeks ago at the New England Division Convention, I had the pleasure of sitting at dinner with several recent engineering graduates who are active amateurs. From Clarkson University, Andrea, not from Georgia Tech. And we chatted about what they were interested in. And antennas, microwaves, and contesting led the list. But at one point, one of them literally bounced in his chair with enthusiasm. He said, "The great thing about amateur radio is that there is so much to do." And of course, he's right. In amateur radio, there's always something new to learn about and to do. We don't have to abandon the old to embrace the new, but we do need to be willing to explore new trails as they open up before us. Consider this. In 1992, at the Los Angeles National Convention, a common lament was that Heathkit had just gone out of business. Kit building had been a big part of amateur radio for more than a generation. And for some, Heath's demise marked altogether the end of amateur radio as we know it. But look at what we have today. Right here in Northern California, you have a company, Elecraft, that was established in 1998, has been growing ever since, providing kits and factory-assembled gear, take your pick, that outperform anything that ever came out of Benton Harbor. And Elecraft is not alone. I got a factory tour on Thursday, but no free samples. There are so many kits available today from so many suppliers, with new ones coming out all the time, that if you tried to build them all, you would never finish. There's tremendous potential for cross-pollination between the do-it-yourself DIY movement and amateur radio. One of the newest ARRL-affiliated clubs is the Hack DC Amateur Radio Club. Hack DC rents space from a church in the District of Columbia, where, for less than the cost of a daily visit to Starbucks, you urban dwellers can enjoy access to a fully equipped workshop that they could never accommodate in a small apartment or condo. A critical mass of hams became involved in Hack DC and formed a club within a club. It'll be interesting to see where this sort of cross-pollination leads. Of course, in amateur radio, we don't develop our radio communication skills and capabilities just for ourselves. Like earlier generations, we want to be of service to our communities and our country. Public service and emergency preparedness are important ways to give back for the privileges that we enjoy in accessing the radio spectrum. But emergency communications and the exploration of new technologies are not mutually exclusive. The more we know, the more capabilities we develop, the more valuable we can be when we're needed. And we will be needed. Society relies ever more heavily on a fragile telecommunications structure that is susceptible to overload and outright failure. We can't substitute for all that infrastructure. We don't have $1 trillion. But because we know how to harness those electromagnetic waves that Heinrich Hertz generated in his lab more than 125 years ago, we know how to harness those. So we can communicate no matter what, and that has real value. Amateur radio exists today because of the vision of those who came before us. The only way we can repay our debt to them is to ensure that amateur radio continues to exist for future generations. The best way to honor our traditions is to translate those traditions so they remain relevant in a changing world. That is, and always has been, the mission of the ARRL. And as we contemplate the beginning of the ARRL's second century and how we will face the challenges and opportunities of an unknown future, I invite you to consider these words penned by our founding president, Hiram Percy Maxim, 85 years ago. This is from September 1927 in QST. He entitled it, "The Reason Why." Sitting back in the old armchair with the last issue of QST read from cover to cover, and with everybody else in the house asleep hours ago, I fell to thinking of amateur radio today and amateur radio of other days. As the blue smoke curls slowly upward from the old pipe, visions of early ARRL directors' meetings float before me. I see those old timers grappling with problems of organization, with QRM, with trunk line traffic and rival amateur leagues. I see sinister commercial and government interests at work seeking to exterminate amateur radio. They were dark days, those early ones. Today, I see amateur radio as an institution recognized by our American government and on the road to recognition by the other governments of the world. I see a fine, loyal ARRL membership of 20,000 standing shoulder to shoulder and believing in each other and still blazing the way in radio communication. I see a rapidly developing worldwide amateur radio brotherhood taking shape in the form of our IARU. And as the last embers of the old pipe turn to gray ash, I ask how it all came about, that the ARRL should have succeeded and all its opponents failed. The answer is clear. It is because with our opponents there was always some kind of a selfish motive to be served for someone, whereas in our ARRL, we insisted from the beginning that no selfish motive for anyone or anything should ever prevail. Everything that ARRL undertakes must be 100% for the general good. That policy bred loyalty and confidence. With those two things, an organization can prosper forever. No selfish motive, loyalty, confidence, and I would add, passion. I believe Mr. Maxim would find that both the ARRL and the IARU of the 21st century remain true to his vision and continue to measure up to his high standards. His ARRL of 20,000 members has grown eightfold and continues to grow. His worldwide brotherhood has expanded to encompass men and women in more than 160 countries. I believe he would be proud of what the ARRL has accomplished, and with your active involvement and support, will continue to accomplish for future generations. I know I am, and I hope so are you. Thank you, and good night.
Wow, that was just really awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dave. You know, Pacificon is so, it's cool. I'll tell you why it's cool. Every year you come here and I meet my ham heroes, and all of them are better than I imagined. They're just as cool as I imagined. So great. And I think that's really the real reason I come back every year. It's just great. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, thank you.